So I asked Walter and a couple other of my friends in this congregation to sort of answer the question that stewardship has posed this year about this issue of light, because I think that that's such a simple little phrase, how do you shine your light? But it's an enormous question, and it's a question of spirituality and how is your inner spiritual life connected to your work in the world. And not all of us sit around reflecting on questions like this. And for me, it's helpful to hear someone else talk about how they've thought about their light, their particular gifts. Maybe you know what theologian, I can't think of it, said, your work in the world is the place where your deep gladness meets the suffering.
Your work in the world is the place where your deep gladness meets the deepest need of the world.
Yeah.
That was Frederick Buechner.
Buechner, okay.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
And it really sort of takes that idea of light. Your light is yours. It's your gift. And are you aware enough of it to meet the world's need? Mm-hmm. And so there are three sorts of questions that I've thought to sort of get to that, to sort of point to that. And my hope is that this conversation will help you to be reflective. Well, it's not, holy Lord. I'll try to get it to stay here. And it probably won't stay here. So when it's not staying here, when it's moved, I'll try to keep looking at you every once in a while so you can signal me. It's a lot better? Okay. You pointed me towards some resources. And one of those was a book called The Spirituality of Imperfection. And I took this quote as really a framing quote for all of these conversations. It's, spirituality is a lot like health. We all have health. We may have good health or poor health, but it's something we can't avoid having. The same is true of spirituality. Every human being is a spiritual being. The question is not whether we have spirituality, but whether the spirituality we have is a negative one that leads to isolation and self-destruction, or one that is more positive and life-giving. I wanted to begin by asking how you would describe the spiritual context of your early life and how that formed you.
Mm-hmm. So I think there are really two short stories that I will use to describe what my early life was like, and hope it will give you a sense of what it has meant for me. My earliest memory is this. I'm 2 years old, and it's been confirmed later by other people, so this really happened. I'm 2 years old, and I'm throwing a temper tantrum. My mother does not know what to do, so she picks me up, she brings me to the kitchen, and she holds me under a cold water faucet because I was holding my breath, too. And then I gasped for air, and that is my earliest memory in life.
That's your earliest memory in life?
Yes, because I was 2. That was my earliest memory in life, and I asked my family, just to make sure this is not an urban legend, and it is my earliest memory. And what it taught me about living in life is that's what I made of it. If you are visible, if I show who I am to you, I am going to be held under the cold water faucet, And it felt in some ways like a death to me. And I've always described it as my cold water baptism into our family religion. So what I learned early on in our family is do not be visible, keep to yourself. If you don't have anything nice to say, do not say it at all. That's nothing new, I'm assuming. And in our family religion, my mother was the high priestess of our religion. My father, who was a scientist and who was distant, my mother would always say, don't bother Dad, because if you bother him, he's going to blow up, because he's always working. So what I learned about life from this is keep your head low, God is distant, and I and my two sisters were the three parishioners of that religion. And that was how I learned to be in the world. And very briefly, the second piece that reinforced it was that in every country where we lived, we were immigrants. And my parents always taught us, you do not belong here. So when they lived in Canada, in the U.S., in Germany, we never belonged. So that was another way. As an immigrant, you better get along, go along to get along. Don't be yourself. Don't emphasize difference. And those things together very much shaped the way I was in the world.
Mm-hmm. You know, I still have this question about that drowning experience. When you reflect back, were you thinking to be visible in the world means you'd better be having a near-death experience, to be that loud, that expressive, that present, or if you're visible in the world, this is what's going to happen?
I wish it was the former, but it was the later, that if I'm visible in the world, I'm going to drown.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was baptism for me in our family church.
Yeah. And so was there also Protestantism in that?
Yeah, I mean, being from Dutch stock, you know, we always talk about the Dutch are God's frozen chosen. And seriously, that there is something about, there's a certain stoicism of being in the world, which is not necessarily connected with spirituality, but that culture, again, reinforced everything.
Yeah. And so, so you would say that your early image of God was, in one sentence?
God was a bit like the IRS, never visible, but you better be aware. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and Mom was kind of the gatekeeper.
Mom was the gatekeeper, yeah.
To something bad that could possibly happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, how did that create your inner world? I mean, how was sort of your inner world formed as a young person and a young adult, and even now?
The gift it gave me, let me talk about the gift it gave me. It gave me the gift to, wherever I go, I always see where the wind is coming from. I try to figure out in this community or any other community what's happening beneath the surface. It gave me the gift of being to get along with about everybody. And that's a good gift. The Hebrew Bible talks about blessings and curses. The curse it gave me was that I have always had a sense that if I become visible and I speak with my own voice, danger will happen to me. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you're jokingly saying, nice that you're here. You were just really playing into that fear. So that's how it's shaped me. That I'm a person. I kind of know what's going on with me, but you may not always see it. That's how I was raised and shaped.
So I hear a lot of shadow.
Exactly.
Language there.
Yeah.
You sort of put some flesh on that for us.
Yeah. So there's this other side of me that I'm always tempted and seduced not to show. With people that know me very well, I'm more vivacious, I'm extroverted, I love singing, I love having corny humor. I also like being edgy and being challenging, and that is the part that I've always kept behind me. We talked a bit conversation about shadow, and there's this theory that many of you may know, that the shadow is the part of yourself that you don't live. So if you think of ourselves as everybody is a complete circle, there are parts of you that you can show everybody. Sometimes you can show your sadness, you can show that you're glad, you can show certain parts, but there are certain parts of ourselves that we have learned we cannot show, and that is the shadow part. And for me, those parts were, well, I learned that I can't show a temper tantrum as an adult, or metaphorically speaking, being angry is difficult. I learned that to stand up and say, hey, this is who I am, deal with it, that's something that was not acceptable in my tradition. Mm-hmm. And those parts and I learned to keep them behind me. Somebody once used the metaphor, you keep them in a big bag and you drag this big bag behind you, but those are still parts of yourself. Mm-hmm. And the work of my life has been to bring them out. There's this great quote by an early Christian saint, Irenaeus, and he says, "The glory of God is the human being fully alive," which I find is lovely because it speaks to me. The glory of God is the human being fully alive. And that's my sense of what we're being called to, and I'm being called to take those pieces of myself that were not acceptable to me and bring them out, because God knows we all need to be fully alive in this day and time, because there's so much bad stuff around us going on. And I believe that that's essential.
I'm thinking about, I don't know what you think of Father Richard Rohr, mm-hmm. who talks a lot of Rohr's stuff comes from Jungian psychology. So Rohr talks about the shadow needing to be in front of you, always. And so that's kind of like integration work, is that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I don't know if I will ever integrate it all, but at least it's good to have in front of me and that I live with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When I was reading some of the resources that you sent me as having been touchstones, I found this quote from Julian of Norwich, I think it's kind of like the Irenaeus quote about the human being fully alive. Julian, a saint, says, "God judges us according to our true essence, which God keeps whole and safe, inside God's self always. Divine judgment reflects our beloved's righteousness." Divine judgment reflects our beloved's righteousness. But human judgment reflects our changeable fleshiness. I could not find blame and anger anywhere in God, which sort of reminds me that the way God sees me is always like in delight at the temper tantrum. How lovely that tantrum is. How beautiful that you're expressing yourself.
Or saying good luck with the temperature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that all of it is required, right? Like all of it is required to be the human being fully alive.
Yeah. I think at this time in my life, one of the things I'm learning on and learned about and I'm chewing on is that I have often had a sense that God is distant from me, but I'm learning to turn it around, that it's actually often me who is distancing himself from God. Mm-hmm. So that I have not trusted in God's delight in myself. That actually God delights in a whole person, in a whole person, not in a perfect person.
That's a nice distinction. You said something to the effect of, this is the work of your life. And I wonder if you would just sort of tell us how vocationally that's played out.
Vocationally, it's played itself out that as a hospital chaplain, I get to sit with people in the reality of their lives. And because I'm not the pastor, I can use a bad word here. So much of our lives we spend believing we have to bullshit. We have to pretend who we are not. We have to put up a front. And in a hospital, be it in a psychiatric hospital or an acute care hospital, the truth is, if you've had a stroke, there's no playing around that you haven't had a stroke. You know, if you've had an episode where you've had to be hospitalized, there is no playing around. And I always feel drawn to situations and people where people have to be real because it reminds me of my own reality and humanity. So I feel so fortunate vocationally that I get to work in a space, to be with people in a space that reminds me and reminds them of how important it is to be with God as our whole selves.
That's so fascinating that this thing that is your work has manifested in your day-to-day life as you're right there. Every moment that you're working, if you're going to show up and be really present with people that are there, they're in the really real.
Yeah, I once said to Jill, my wife, I feel really fortunate that I make money off of my neurosis. I mean, there is something about that I believe in our whole vocation. Sometimes people are called, they're perfect piano players, and they make this career out of perfect piano playing. That's great. And for me, parts of my life that I wished may not have happened, I'm now generally content with and grateful for, and that I can make a living, and it is not just a living, but it is a vocation for me.
Yeah. I see really clearly if this question about how is your light, how are you nurturing and shining your light in the world, it seems obvious to me from this story about how you do that. You might have not such kind words for...
Probably not.
Yeah,
yes.
for yourself. But I'm curious now to ask about showing up in a faith community or church, because the question stewardship wants folks to be reflective about is how does the church nurture, or how does it become a place that helps your light to shine in the world? I'm really curious about.
I have two answers for that. The first one is, as a small kid, faith community, the Presbyterian church, the first 6 years of life where I grew up, was a sanctuary for me. That was a place where family religion was not lived. I remember the small kids of candlelight services or singing in the choir. That was sanctuary for me. As an adult, I have had to find my way back into faith community. It's been for me an acquired taste, a bit like cooked carrots or cod liver oil. The reason being that I know it's the best thing for me to engage with people, to become visible, to find out who you are, who I am, how we are in this relationship together. It doesn't come natural to me. It is something that I've had to learn. For me, actually, what you called liminal space, the space where God shows up, is when I come into the faith community and I push myself to step out of my, whatever it is, kind of like I'm walking in muck, but I step out of it and say, okay, who are you and who I am? Who am I? And that for me that's such an important experience, to step into relationships with others. It's something I have to practice my whole life. The second thing, what I thought about this morning is, especially considering what happened the last days, we are all such tribal people, and I believe that it's in our genetics to go to good, bad, in, out, dark, light, to separate ourselves. And that happens in communities like this too. And for me, this is a place to practice. How can I be both clear about my convictions, but also not demonize the other person? Because I'm assuming you have what I have. You come back from a Sunday or from a weekly meeting and you think, oh my goodness, what was so-and-so thinking? Or something bugs you. And to remind myself both that I am fully human and the other person is fully human. That's what a faith community is there for me. And I've gotten to the point where I like coming on a Sunday morning, but it's been an uphill thing for me.
It's a real discipline. It sounds
is a discipline, yes. It's like knowing when I have to do my exercises. Some people love doing them, and I just think I feel so good when I'm done.
Well, yeah. It feels so good when I can go home and have my cup of coffee in silence. When I asked you to sort of summarize what church meant to you, you said, it's the place where I get to practice being who I really am.
And allowing others to be who they really are. Because that's just as hard. I could easily try to make you conform to an image of who I am, subtly or not so subtly. And it's really I believe it's one of my callings. And now I'm going to step out on a limb, try to be visual. I actually believe it's one of all of our callings, you too, to be real here and to invite others to be real too. Because where else do we do it? If not here, where else? So that's what I believe.
Yeah, I'm really grateful that you've shared that with us, which I think is a gift, because when you are real and you are sort of telling us the truth, I feel like my realness, my authenticity is welcome with you and greeted by you. And I think that's a really powerful gift that you give.
And that's what I'm working on.
Wow. I'm so glad.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you're working on it. Thank you.
Thank you.